But first, when Anthony Albanese rose to address the United Nations overnight, the gulf between his worldview and President Trump's could not have been more stark. On issue after issue, Albanese positioned himself in direct opposition to Australia's closest and most vital strategic and security ally. His remarks laid bare the warped priorities of his government, an embarrassing display when set against the clarity and authority of the United States. Even speaking about the United Nations itself, Albanese drifted into immature and uncritical idealism, while President Trump cut through the pretense. The institution is broken, compromised, and ineffectual. Here was Donald Trump making some of these points.
Likewise, in a period of just 7 months, I have ended 7 unendable wars. It's too bad that I had to do these things instead of the United Nations doing them. And sadly, in all cases, the United Nations did not even try to help in any of them. I ended 7 wars, dealt with the leaders of each and every one of these countries, and never even received a phone call from the United Nations offering to help in finalizing the deal.
In open defiance of the US president, Albanese went out of his way to praise the UN in the most glowing terms. It was his first ever address to the United Nations, and he approached it with childlike naivety. He spoke with reverence about its noble purpose, its shared mission, and enduring ideals. Never mind that dictators preside over human rights councils, yet lecture free nations. And never mind that the UN has stood idle in the face of terror and has done nothing to secure the release of hostages. There stood idealistic Albo, blind to reality and captured by an illusion.
The United Nations is much more than an arena for the great powers to veto each other's ambitions. This is a platform for middle powers and small nations to voice and achieve our aspirations.
On the topic of climate change, Trump and Albanese were worlds apart. Trump said climate change was the greatest con job ever perpetrated on the world, and he spoke about inaccurate predictions on climate at the UN.
In 1982, the executive director of the United Nations Environmental Program predicted that by the year 2000, climate change would cause a global catastrophe. He said that it will be irreversible, as any nuclear holocaust would be. This is what they said at the United Nations. What happened? Here we are. Another UN official stated in 1989 that within a decade, entire nations could be wiped off the map by global warming. Not happening.
And the president also had a warning for the likes of Australia.
If you don't get away from this green scam, your country is going to fail.
And Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement in 2020. But Albanese's position is the polar opposite. He wants to be world leading in emissions reduction, no matter the cost. And that is what Chris Bowen has said, at any cost. And Albanese in his speech reiterated his climate mania.
Australia is acting to meet the environmental challenge of climate change while working to seize and share the economic opportunities of renewable energy. We will meet our 2030 target of 43% emissions reduction on 2005 levels. And last week, we set our target for 2035, cutting emissions by 62 to 70%. We are honouring our commitment to the Paris Agreement and its goal of keeping global temperatures below dangerous levels.
In an exclusive interview with me tonight, former UK Prime Minister Liz Truss comes out against Albanese's position.
I think things like Paris are now dead. I just don't think it's credible to carry on when the United States aren't following it. Countries like China and India are busy building coal-fired power stations and using oil and gas.
Now, Trump's greatest concerns are migration and the green energy obsession, as he calls it. Well, Albanese has run a high immigration agenda as Prime Minister, and he's transitioning Australia to renewables at a fast and unsustainable pace. So on virtually every subject, Albanese and Trump stood opposed. And as for the speech itself, well, Albanese's delivery was flat and lifeless. He's a terrible orator, out of his depth. To stand before the United Nations with the world's attention and squander the moment with poor delivery of a dull speech is embarrassing. The only topic where Albanese spoke with any enthusiasm or even expression was when he turned to his lifelong fixation, the plight of the Palestinians. Now, here's how he started this section.
The principles on which the United Nations was founded still hold life and weight and meaning and hope for the people who need them most. And nowhere is that task more urgent than the Middle East.
You can hear the sudden passion in his voice, and it's revealing of his true priorities.
This week, Australia recognised the state of Palestine because, to quote from the Charter, that forms the very foundations of this institution and reflects the very best of its idealism. We are determined, quote, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war.
So passion for Palestinian recognition, but just a passing reference to the forgotten and starved hostages in unbearable conditions deep underground. Well, how different were his remarks from Trump's moral clarity? Because here's what the US president said about Palestinian recognition.
Now, as if to encourage continued conflict, some of this body is seeking to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities. This would be a reward for these horrible atrocities.
And yes, it is a reward for the terrorism of October 7. Albanese seems to forget that an Australian was murdered on October 7, Galit Carbone, at Kibbutz Be'eri. Her brother Danny is a friend of mine, and he's extremely critical of how Albanese has approached this issue. But for Trump, the hostages are the single most important factor. There can be no ceasefire until the hostages are home. Trump knows that. And the war cannot end until Hamas is defeated.
Those who want peace should be united with one message: release the hostages now. Just release the hostages now. Okay.
And this is the fraudulence of Albanese's position. He pays lip service to the idea that Hamas can have no future role in Gaza, but he doesn't make it clear how Hamas, how the terrorists will be removed if Israel doesn't do it, if Israel withdraws. This is something I spoke with Paul Kelly about last night.
He says this all the time. He says that Hamas will be removed, that Hamas will be disarmed, it will have no future political role in Gaza. He says that this will lead to a ceasefire. He says this will lead to the release of the hostages. How? None of this is explained. There is no credible pathway offered by the Australian government in terms of sorting out how these objectives are to be realised. This is an expression of hope. And essentially what we see here is, I think we see politicians doing what they've wanted to do for a long period of time.
Exactly.
They've wanted to recognise a Palestinian state.
And this is right. Albanese formed his views on Israel and the Palestinian territories when he was at university. And by the time he was in federal politics in Canberra, he was a full-blown activist, yelling into the megaphone at rallies outside the American Embassy in Sydney.
The response of Israel has been to meet children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
And Albanese's parliamentary speeches on this topic, of which I have read all of them, from the early 2000s until 2017, are full of inaccuracies. In 1998, Albanese went to the Palestinian territories and Gaza, Ramallah and Gaza, meeting secretly with the late Palestinian president Yasser Arafat. You're looking at that photo now. It was a meeting he never disclosed. We didn't even know about this meeting until a former Palestinian ambassador, Ali Kazak, who took Albanese to meet Arafat, published the photograph in the wake of October 7. And Albanese did not meet the Israeli Prime Minister at the time. It was Benjamin Netanyahu, or the Israeli president. His trip was sponsored by the Palestine Liberation Organization, and it was all expenses paid, including flights and accommodation. The next year, he set up the Australian Parliamentary Friends of Palestine group. And Albanese has never been back to Israel. He formed his views as a young activist and then never returned, never expanded or even corrected his knowledge or interpretation of events. So speaking about Palestinian recognition at the United Nations this week is a lifelong dream for the radical left activist we now have as our Prime Minister. Now, one of the few decent remarks Albanese did make in his UN address was about Iranian interference in Australia. And there was a single, quick, passing mention of anti-Semitism.
Just last month, Australian security agencies confirmed that the Iranian regime orchestrated the firebombing of a synagogue in Melbourne and a Jewish restaurant in Sydney. Criminal acts of cowardice aimed at spreading fear. And here at the United Nations, we repeat to the world, there is no place for anti-Semitism.
Now, of course, the President of the United States has more important things to do than sit and watch Albanese speak at the UN, although he knows Albanese's type. And Albanese was in the room at the United Nations when Trump spoke. You can see him in the audience here. Yep, Albanese was forced to listen to the most powerful man in the world explain why he and those like him are wrong on Palestinian recognition, renewable obsession and high immigration. But Albanese's address to the UN underscored just how deeply his agenda and values diverge from Trump's. Albanese is trying not to offend Donald Trump. He desperately wants to meet him on October 20. He doesn't want another cancelled meeting or rebuffed phone call. He wants more than a selfie after cornering Trump at a large event. And this is not because he holds Trump in high regard, we know he doesn't, or because he remotely agrees with him, but because it's utterly humiliating that Australia's Prime Minister has been snubbed, dismissed and given the cold shoulder by our most critical ally, who happens to be the leader of the free world.